Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining Indicio Identity Community event for March. We have amazing speakers today. Our topic is NFTs and DIDs. And our speaker is Daniel Bachner, head of decentralized identity from Block, and Christina Partner, digital policy advisor from Native Trust Consulting, and Sam Current. He's gonna be moderating today. He is a software architect from Indicio. Quickly about Indicio, we are a public benefit corporation, and we help enterprise to solve the problem about identity and decentralized identity. We have Indicio network with 25 node operators. If you have any questions, please feel free to write me, maya@indicio.tech. We have so much to cover today. Without further ado, Sam, please take away.
Awesome. Thanks to everyone for being here. And I especially grateful for Daniel and Christina for being willing to discuss with us today. Looking forward to hearing from your experience and from your knowledge on these things as we discuss NFTs and DIDs and VCs and how they apply, where they overlap, where they don't, and all things in between. So super grateful for you being here. I think I've successfully warned my kids that it's a bad time to practice the banjo or the drums. So we'll see how this goes today, and excited to be here. To get started, this is a topic that I think most of us have some experience with some aspect and probably not with others. And so I thought we'd start with some definitions. And that way we can sort of level set a little bit. This is not intended to be very deeply technical, but of course, some of the technical details matter and part of the discussion. So, you know, having a background will help. So let's start here a little bit. And Christina, if I could ask you to give us a working definition of an NFT.
Sure. So the textbook definition of an NFT is really blockchain-based tokens. They're definitely unique, and they contain unique data and identifiers. They've been designed to be transferable. You know, probably a lot of folks have heard about them in the context of digital artwork or collectibles. But really what they do is their representation of something that's a real world asset. Most folks probably already know that it's maintained on a blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, or ETH as we like to call it. And so the ownership of an NFT is tied to an ETH address. And so from that perspective, it represents a private, secure kind of user-owned digital identity where we can do traceability with it. But it also has some limitations, which I anticipate we're going to be talking about today.
Awesome. So to clarify, NFT stands for?
Non-fungible tokens versus fungible tokens.
And what does that mean? What does fungible mean?
So fungible meaning, you know, and actually it's really funny that you say that, because non-fungible meaning there's a fungible aspect and a non-fungible aspect. So it's a representation of something that's real, but it's actually in digital format. So it has two aspects to it, or two components, two sides of it. If you want to think about it as a coin, it has like a real, quote unquote, a real physical world aspect to it, and then the digital interpretation of it on the other side.
Right. So a practical piece of non-fungible might be that it's not exactly like a currency. It's a thing itself, and it's not divisible. Is one of the side effects of being non-fungible.
Correct. Exactly. You can't actually take it into more than, you know, basically two pieces, or it's really one identification of two pieces, right? The digital aspect, or the digital manifestation of what's actually a physical piece, right? So together they create one thing. It is not divisible.
Right. Excellent. So Daniel, if you would give us a working definition of a decentralized identifier, or a DID.
Yeah, so decentralized identifiers, as opposed to current decentralized identifiers like email addresses or domain names, are identifiers that you own, you know, or an entity owns, wholly and separately from any other reliant party, like a provider or some sort of website that hosts it for them. These are identifiers that are typically non-transferable. Some have those properties. They're owned by who created them for their whole lifetime, and they're assumed to be yours, right? Because identity itself is typically not transferable, right? Your identity is not something that you can just gift to someone else. So these DIDs have all the properties of decentralization as blockchain tokens. They just are purposed differently, and they enable you to do things like log in maybe without a Google or Facebook login. Maybe you can log in with an ID that you own for once.
That's awesome. Okay, two more. Christina, if you'll give us a working definition of smart contracts, which heavily relate, of course, to NFTs.
Absolutely. So smart contracts meaning they're digitally signed or digitally traceable back to an individual or an entity that actually binds to a thing, right? It binds multiple things to kind of the beginning. You can trace it from start to end. So the way I think about it is almost like I buy my car. You could always go to Carfax, trace it from start to end, who owned it, when it was serviced. It actually has the whole life cycle of the vehicle that's actually managed and maintained. And so the smart contract is a binding thing between one or more entities and allows traceability to the purpose of completing a function or some kind of an outcome.
Awesome. And Daniel, our final definition here of verifiable credential.
Yeah, so verifiable credential, it sounds kind of official, but really in the end, it's a document format for being able to encapsulate some sort of data and sign over it from some source, right? So think about like, you have Alice and she goes to school at a university. The degree that she might get is a digital proof by the source, the university, that says, we believe we're going to confer upon you the fact that you've graduated with this degree, right? So you could put any piece of data inside of a credential, and really it's about, do you trust who issued the credential? It could be issued by one or more parties, and because trust is always an evaluation that a verifier or a person relying on the credential sort of uses to assess the world, it's always in the eye of the beholder. So you might trust a source and another person might not trust that source. It's just a framework for being able to make trusted assertions over data.
Awesome. Okay, a bit of mechanics here. The chat is open and you're welcome to ask stuff in chat. We will likely not be reading and responding during most of our discussion here in real time, but there are other folks offering answers in the chat to questions that people ask, and that's a great thing. Go ahead and do that. There's not really a restriction that we want to place there, but we won't be able to respond necessarily in real time. If we have a couple minutes at the end, fielding some questions would be fun, and so keep that in mind. Great. Okay, so NFTs are a newer technology, and VCs have been around a lot. There's been a lot of popular discussion about that and applications and things as happen, and lots of debate there, which has been really good. And so I want to start talking about maybe the sweet spot of NFTs and the sweet spot of verifiable credentials, and where they overlap is likely to be some discussion. But if we can stick to just the sort of the sweet spots now of how that works, I think that would help get the conversation started. Christina, what do you think is the sweet spot of NFTs? What do NFTs do well?
I think what NFTs do well is allow the public to understand certain aspects of our digital identity. So for example, I can identify myself when I'm hanging out with my friends as a runner because I'm a big runner, right? So I could actually have an NFT that digitally represents my running, whether it's my sub-4 time, because when you're a marathon runner, like everybody's holy grail is getting under 4 hours, or if it identifies me as the digital policy consultant when I'm at work, it allows me to express myself through a digital identity of my choosing. And so I think that NFTs are really great for that. From an individual perspective. And then of course, everybody's heard the hype in terms of artwork, collectibles, et cetera. But I like to think that that's sort of the surface and that's the shiny stuff. And under the surface, it allows us to express other things. For example, you might want to own an NFT of a character in a sitcom, right? That allows you to specifically own that character, either as an investment or as an expression of who you are. And so anything that allows us to publicly express an identity, a sentiment, a feeling, a piece of artwork, something funny maybe that you've recorded. It doesn't have to be a static thing. It could be a video, like a TikTok video that you decide to turn into an NFT. But anything that's sort of fun, interesting, publicly exposed that you feel comfortable exposing. Right. So this is not intended to be like Christina Podnar, my marriage certificate necessarily, unless you really want the world to see that. It really is supposed to be a public aspect or an interpretation of something that you want to share.
Excellent. Daniel, what do VCs, what's the sweet spot of verifiable credentials?
Yeah, I would say
identity?
any trusted assertion from yourself, just to kind of level set, you can create a verifiable credential that you self-sign, sort of your assertion to the world, and you can make them very public. So you could, as Christina was noting, you could actually have a VC sign with your DID that says I'm a runner, and then you could publish that widely, right, in relation to an ID that people knew. They could say Christina's saying she's a runner. She could also, go to a race, right, that's probably being held by some sort of organization. And whenever she crosses the finish line, someone, times her in, and then they issue her a credential that says you ran this race in this time, right? And she can publish that widely, or she could keep it very private. The interesting thing about accomplishments and personal identities, they're not transferable. VCs have this really wonderful property, and it's actually really important, because if Christina was to sort of transfer her time of 3 hours and 50 minutes to someone else, they actually wouldn't have run the race in 3 hours and 50 minutes. So it's an important aspect to think about with NFTs. And I would say that the sweet spot for DIDs is every single use case that doesn't require unfettered market sales, secondary sales. So some good examples of that might be completely anonymous sales of points for things, completely anonymous. And, I touched a third rail here, but, drug sales, right? You want drug sales to be something that's completely unfettered secondary market where there's no one involved, right? Some examples of the opposite where you don't need unfettered secondary markets is like Airbnb. I want to give someone a key to my Airbnb, and it's, yes, I'm selling them access, but I want revocability. I want control. I am, after all, the owner. I'm not going to throw my key out there into the ether, no pun intended, and just have it be saleable without my knowledge, right? So I would say that DIDs have a wide berth and they encompass many use cases.
So Christina, you mentioned sort of the public aspect of that, and NFTs are without a doubt designed to be public. And Daniel, you mentioned the sale of accomplishments. I may be stirring up controversy here, but one thing that occurred to me was an Olympic gold medal. Imagine, so I go to the Olympics, I win a gold medal in something. I'm unqualified to win a gold medal in anything, so this is purely hypothetical. Some athletes have been known to sell their gold medals to collectors, and this would be an interesting aspect, because the possession of the medal doesn't mean that you won it, but it's certainly an item of collection there. And so there's an interesting aspect, because certainly as the athlete who actually won the gold medal, I would want to be able to prove that it was I who won the gold medal. But perhaps the award that I received might be something that could be in effect transferable, though certainly the record of the accomplishment could not be. And so that's an interesting real life parallel, I think, that sort of lands squarely in the messy area between NFTs and DIDs. And I keep saying DIDs, but VCs and DIDs as a combination. And that's interesting. So Christina, what you mentioned about the sharing aspect of NFTs and how useful that can be. The nature of NFTs are that they're either public or they are they're all public in that sense. You can't really have a private NFT. And so in that sense, if I have an accomplishment that I want to share in a limited way, is that just completely out of scope for NFTs? Is that outside the bounds of what they're capable of?
Well, it's not outside of the bounds of what they're capable of, but it's really not what the intent is, right? And we see this, for example, Lamborghini is using this as a marketing ploy as of late, where you can buy an NFT, and it's fascinating because it has a piece of the space shuttle that's actually sold with it, right? But it doesn't mean that I went to space just because I have a piece of the space shuttle. I didn't bring it back with me, right? It's not like I did this, right? It just represents that I own a piece of something. And so it really is intended to be more public, and not necessarily public in the moment, but in the sense that it's actually traceable, right? It actually has traceability to it. For example, I can trace either that gold medal being handed out at a very specific point in time at a race, or I can actually trace that piece of the space shuttle to back its original moment in time when it was actually in space. And so it's intended to be a verifiable, traceable public thing. So I don't really see NFTs as being intended for kind of the private aspect, right? Whereas I think like DIDs or VIs, I would actually expect that those we would start to use more for private means or for truly verifiable personal identity reasons, not something that I would actually hinge off of an NFT.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, noting as a counterpoint, tons of VCs are public, right? Like your Twitter blue check mark is going to be a public VC. Someone says, I've evaluated you, you're a person that meets some bar, some criteria. Your diplomas that you get from schools are probably public. In fact, I believe that LinkedIn is going to start taking these VCs and very publicly displaying the fact that they validated VCs that stand for the information in your LinkedIn profiles. So VCs have the interesting capacity that they're really well attuned for a lot of both public and private use cases. The one distinguishing factor, and there's actually a caveat there, is that they may not be good for secondhand sales in the sense that if I want to sell a VC because they come from an issuer and they're not tokens, you can't just sell them without that party, that issuer being involved. And that's like a very differentiating factor, right? But one use case comes to mind where, it's on its face, it kind of looks like maybe you'd want to do it, but it ends up really being a VC use case. Like people look at Ticketmaster and secondhand sales for events, right? And they say, wow, event tickets, that's gonna be a really great thing that we want to tokenize. And then you kind of dig a little deeper and you're like, well, what are these companies really doing? And you sit down and you ask them, well, why do you use these services that sell your tickets secondhand? Do they have some overwhelming love for these services? Not really. I mean, these services charge a ton of money. Ticketmaster, there's like jokes about how many fees they include in their final bill, and all these things, right? They do it because it's very difficult to be able to have a single standard way to sell these things and to represent them. So they kind of give the ability away. Now, one cool thing about VCs is, imagine you are a season ticket holder and you got a VC that says, you own this ticket, because these are the season ticket holders, the first to get the tickets out of the gate. And then Alice, the season ticket holder, wants to sell her ticket to Bob. Well, as long as, let's say the Seahawks organization is comfortable running a very standard personal data store that uses VCs, Alice can go to using standard APIs and say, hey, I'd like to transfer this to Bob's DID. And so they could Christmas tree this VC. They could say it was started with Alice. Now I'm assigning it to Bob, right? And yes, there's an intermediary involved. But interestingly enough, it's a centralized intermediary that really does control the event, because no matter how you sell the ticket, you're going to the Seahawks stadium and they actually control who gets to come in. So the reality is that there's a third party, centralized party in there, no matter what you do. You're never going to take the Seahawks out of C-Link Stadium, and they're always going to be the ones running the event. So my pitch as a business person, when I go in and I look at a use case like that, I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to sell you a system that does it better, faster, cheaper, probably to 3 or 4 orders of magnitude cheaper. And it has the same outcome, and you have control as an organization as you want. And it's still standard and it's still open, and the IDs are centralized. So what I would do is just when you look at a use case, even if it looks like immediately like, oh, people sell things like that, does it really need unfettered secondary market activity? Right. And that's a big one.
So you brought up the ticket one is one of the things that's talked about a lot for NFTs, right? And so you're proposing as a strategy for VCs that of course you can't transfer it without sort of the original ticket issuer involved. You've got to go to them and say, I'd like to do that transfer, and they then issue that VC. And in doing so, they can basically manage the double spend problem. They can make sure that there's not more than one copy of that particular ticket around. So Christina, can you outline for us sort of what the use case for event tickets look like in the NFT world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the great thing about NFTs is that you can actually trade them online, et cetera. What we can actually do is have traceability from the blockchain perspective in terms of who's had them and when they've exchanged hands. The problem that we have, obviously, is that, they can be stolen, right? So I think that kind of going back to Daniel's point, the nice thing there is that you can actually understand when you're buying, from a VC perspective, an actual ticket, that there's been some identity or some verification in place. Whereas in NFT land, we can actually have a situation where I could be selling a stolen NFT that's representative of that ticket, and you actually get to the Seahawks stadium, and all of a sudden you can't use your ticket to get in because I've actually stolen it and resold it from an NFT perspective. And so I think that that's a limiting factor. In fact, as Daniel was talking about this, I was thinking about a really good example of why not use NFTs for something where it really, really matters that you have true identity. And so recently I went to have my son's passport renewed. And I thought, how dumb. Couldn't they just say, look, if I have his birth certificate, I'm his mother, right? Or I'm his father, give the kid a passport, for heaven's sake. Instead, they meant me trot down to the local post office where I had to pay an extra $35 for a woman to look. Didn't even take a copy of it. She just looked at my driver's license and said, yes, you're Christina. You're that mother that it says on the birth certificate. And I thought, there's no freaking photo on the birth certificate. All she's doing is verifying my signature off of a birth certificate onto my driver's license and saying you are who you are. And so I think that when there is that extra step needed for validity, right? To ensure that I haven't stolen my child or I haven't stolen the ticket, to an event, Seahawks event. I think you want to actually have somebody who's actually standing there saying, no, this is authentic. You can rely on it. It's not going to be revoked, or it's not going to be claimed as being stolen, even though from start to finish, you can actually understand the transfer of the identity. Just because it means that at the end of the day, that a Picasso sitting in my house doesn't mean I haven't stolen it, right? And so that's sort of how I think about it from a event ticketing perspective is, if it's a $15 local gig, no big deal. If it's probably $100-something Seahawk ticket, I definitely want to know that it's authentic. And I'm not actually going to be stopped at the gate because somebody's verified the authenticity, not necessarily of that thing, right? Because from an NFT perspective, I know that it's authentic, but there's actually credibility in the validity that now that it's been transferred to me, I actually own it and it cannot be revoked.
So one of the technical features of an NFT is that it can have one and only one owner, meaning you can't have two people claiming to own it. One of them is verifiably correct and one of them isn't. Now, I'm ignoring the steal use case that you brought up, right? Because if someone manages to guess the keys or gain access to the keys that I have that signify that I own it, then they can run away with it and anything else attached to that key. And there's not a lot I can actually do about that. Right? Correct.
And I think that this is the point, right? I don't even have to tackle you to the ground right now, right? Sam, you might be thinking of oh my gosh, he's going to tackle me to the ground, take it and run with it. All I have to do is do a pretty good phishing scheme, right? And get people to willingly give up their rights, which as we see from corporations today, isn't that hard of a feat after all. And so I think that we need to think about it from that perspective rather than, storm the castle and steal the keys.
Yeah, right. One other aspect, to sort of drive this home a little bit is even in scenarios where you might actually want sales, but you want some oversight. And again, unfettered secondary market's very different, right? You literally can sell it to anyone. One of those things that's important to understand is VCs and DIDs have delegation capabilities. So you could say, if I'm the Seahawks organization, I want to delegate to other marketplaces that have key control so that if it's one of them signing, right, they can all participate in protocols that aren't blockchains, but ensure that the double spend isn't there. So you can still have markets. They're not completely unfettered, but the uses and needs for unfettered secondary markets, my argument is few and far between, right? Even people say, well, we can do, stock exchange somewhere. That's actually not an unfettered secondary market. Most people are comfortable with there being trading houses that may not take any really margin in the future, but they're still there to sort of sign off on the fact that something has been validated, right? It's not just, you're losing 1 million shares, you can't get it back. Because if there's something that occurs that is truly a breach and someone's keys are stolen, that I don't know, some wealthy person like Bill Gates didn't just sell 100% of his shares overnight, it's revocable. So you could say that activity that didn't actually happen. And that's the cool part about VCs. If you don't need the actual throw it into the abyss secondary market, it's not coming back to you under any circumstances sort of use case, you have some outs with VCs and DIDs.
That's a really good analysis, and I appreciate that. So NFTs in particular, VCs are young still. The concepts have been around for a while. NFTs are even younger. I'm curious about what might be the technical developments on both of these technologies that might address or change the shape of how they're best applied in the future. Christina, what do you see could happen as a result of continued development?
You know, I'm kind of looking at things like interoperability. I guess to me, like, I'm all about like standardization and interoperability. And that's where I really see the development from an NFT perspective heading, right? So I'm kind of maybe getting ahead of myself here, but I'm thinking about exchanges of currency in virtual environments, obviously gaming, internationalization. I'm seeing the potential for a lot of, maybe this is because also I'm stuck in the corporate world most of the day working with multinationals, but I'm seeing the benefits of trading things that are of value across platforms and across environments that historically have not been standardized upon. And so when we start talking about the access to education or the access to medical treatments, access to other things, I think that NFT creates a really interesting playing field that's more even than we've actually seen historically. So I get more excited about that. So as a currency or as something that can be of value and traded, in that context, I think that that's where I see that going and I get excited about it. I also hope that we're going to get away from just like NFTs as artwork, because I think like that's kind of just so, I mean, that's great, right? Like it's a good starting point, I think, in terms of young days. But I just see that that's sort of just very topical. It's very much thinking about how we've thought about things historically. And what we haven't done is really thought more deeply around, when I talk about like a virtual or an augmented reality, do NFTs allow me to expose different aspects of myself and how I want to be seen in that environment, not necessarily just as you see me today on this conference call or this meetup. And so I think that there's definitely novel ways of interpretation. But what's interesting is I think that in that context, we might actually have to marry that up. So for example, kind of going back, I think, to Daniel's point, if I want to be performing a surgery on a digital twin and leading the way, where I'm talking to individuals about my new methods of exploratory surgery, I do actually have to have some kind of provability that I'm actually a medical doctor, and an NFT isn't going to do that trick for me. So I do think that we're talking about NFTs plus in terms of the way that we see our identities in the digital world going forward. But that's one thing that I hope that we're going to develop, is that ability to share, to identify, to quickly interchange in terms of environments, data and personalization.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing, data and personalization in some of these augmented reality scenarios. One thing I would sort of call people's attention to is there's this third horseman of the DID trifecta, which is personal data stores, right? Like I can actually envision a time coming very soon where application services on the websites and virtual reality environments will ask you, what DID do you want to be inside? Preferences do you want me to draw from, or things to augment this experience would you like me to draw from? And what you can do is you can say, here's a DID of mine. I'll prove that I own it, similar to how I proved that I own some Bitcoin. And once they have it, they can actually resolve the DID and they can go to a personal data store, which has information that's signed with your ID. And that information can include, vector graphics or voxels that you want to be displayed as in a virtual environment. It could include preferences that you want a company to have, like say, like you're going traveling and you want, you're an airline and maybe a hotel to have your preferences, right? These are things that once you communicate a DID, you can give people permission to access to data that helps augment all of these experiences. And the coolest part about that is that DIDs, VCs, and hubs, they're all operate on a layer above the blockchain, even though some DIDs use a blockchain. And so it means that you can achieve massive scale, right? Incredible scale, like basically the same scale you're used to with traditional networks, and have exactly that same experience. So it's something I encourage people to look into. I think the personal data store and application data store is the next wave of DIDs and VCs that will sort of complete that three-part triangle, and really people start seeing the value at that point.
So Daniel, Christina, oh, sorry, did you have something to say, Christina?
Oh, no, I was just thinking about it. Like, as Daniel's talking, I'm kind of thinking about my personal use cases, right? Because I actually agree with that. And I've been thinking about this because most people look at me and they listen to me. And what they don't realize is that I'm a dual citizen. They don't realize that I'm a non-native English speaker, right? Because you're listening to me and my English sounds pretty good and I don't look like I'm from someplace else. And so I'm kind of thinking about my use case where my NFT could actually be the persona or the aspect of me where I do choose to share, for example, my non-native English speaking capability. And my DID is an aspect of I can actually move through a region because of my dual citizenship. And so I think that when we take who we are and we parlay it sort of into the digital world, and when we think about NFTs versus DIDs and how we might want to apply that, in some instances, we're actually looking to share something that's maybe a little bit more superficial, even though it might be meaningful to us, it's superficial. There's not really real consequences to sharing that information in terms of the impact of it. Versus if I wanted to apply to a university and get free tuition for the next 10 years of my life, because I'm a resident of a specific country, then it would start to really matter. And I can actually invoke like a DID, for example, or a VC. So I think that like thinking about actual use cases and world life experiences that take us beyond this kind of physical digital world into more of a digital world, I think it starts to be an interesting use case scenario that maybe has a little bit more of an in and out between the different technologies rather than a straight across kind of use case experience.
So Daniel, NFTs are public by default. You mentioned that VCs can serve a spectrum of either very private to very public. NFTs have that now because it's kind of inherent to the architecture. And you talked a little bit about these stores. How do the availability of these stores or the use of these stores affect or allow the spectrum of visibility for VCs that you've talked about?
Yeah, so in some of these application data structure instructions, one notable one being the Identity Hub work that's going on in DIF, which should see reference implementation pop out any week now. They're based on decentralized protocols. They may not be a blockchain, right? A decentralized application or data store is typically going to be something that has multiple instances of yours. Like it could live on your devices, it could live at remote endpoints. And just think about it as like your own personal little mesh of your application data, what people can send messages to. The protocols to address those data stores, the instances of yours, is a decentralized protocol. It's just not a blockchain, right? It's just the way IPFS is not a blockchain. It uses things like DHTs and other forms of decentralized technology to make sure that messages can go over a wide area of the network and make their way to a destination. So if you wanted to be able to have assurances that you're going to get a message right to your data store, maybe someone asking you for some preference of yours, or anything out of that, you can have as high assurances as you want in terms of how robustly you stand up instances to that. The cool thing is it's really instantaneous. A lot of these transfer protocols that are decentralized but not blockchains at that level are very close to the performance you would expect out of a traditional system. They're a little bit more latency, right, because they are having to hop through potentially more areas of the network, but you do get this robust assurance. And especially when you back up data that's intentionally supposed to be public using IPFS, right? So if you were to say, I'm going to do decentralized Twitter, right? It'd be impossible really to do decentralized Twitter on a blockchain. We all know the data's at a premium. You wouldn't have each tweet be an NFT. It just doesn't scale. It doesn't work, right? And I would posit to you, it's probably almost nearly NP hard, and it probably will never work. But what you might do is you might have an ID that links to one of these application stores, and you put in a tweet into your data store. And then if someone knows an ID of your very public persona that kind of stands for your Twitter persona, they could follow your DID, they could look up your data store instance, and they could say, give me all your latest tweets, right? And that would work almost just like the regular, infrastructure we have today. Very similar performance profiles, very similar cost structures, right? We're not going into businesses saying accept some exotic sort of uneven user experience or wildly fluctuating prices or anything like that. Once you get a DID, you're pretty much set in terms of the value proposition.
Awesome, thank you. Christina, you have quite a bit of experience in policy in the enterprise. when you, what are some advice for those listening that are involved in an enterprise space instead of a more personal space about how to evaluate data and NFTs and VCs in a world like today?
Well, most of the things that I'm seeing right now is organizations are dabbling and in the NFT space, trying to actually understand what the actual world value is going to be. We're seeing more of an adoption in the luxury brand perspective. But as I mentioned earlier, like Lamborghini is just dipping their toe in right now. They actually released their first campaign to see whether or not it's viable. I think the really big thing for any organization that right now is trying to understand what the applicability is. Everybody's really struggling with trying to understand what the value is. What is the commercial value to the end user? And also, how is it going to be perceived? So for example, if I'm actually going to use NFTs, they are based on the blockchain. There's actually an ecological impact to that. There's actually a cost to the environment of using NFTs. And so when you're talking about consumers are interested certainly in the user experience. What can this do for me, et cetera? But they're also very concerned about the implications on the environment, on society, et cetera. And so I think for any entity, you need to look at it holistically and say, okay, beyond just being really, really cool and being really innovative and being really fun and the buzzword of it today, how am I going to be seen from that environmental, social governance perspective? And what does that mean to my brand? And so very much thinking about it on par of having a little lab, a little pilot, seeing how it goes, trying to understand what are the opportunities of NFTs, of these technologies versus like what kind of a risk are you taking, I think is very, very formidable. There are use cases, of course, where we can use this technology and have it be a good thing. And we're seeing organizations play around with that. Things like, are you using DIDs for like online shopping experiences? Things like, confidential customer engagements. Do I need to actually have verifiability of things like goods imported and exported out of countries, understanding that if I buy something organic, that all of the components were really organic, and I start to make that organic product and stamp it, trying to really understand the use cases for each technology. And I think doing that in like a pilot lab environment is critical, because what I've seen is that other companies have actually just gone full board because it's like the trendy thing to do right now, or everybody wants the latest headline, being able to say, hey, we're in the metaverse. Right, that's actually at a potential cost. And so I think, again, kind of baby steps are good. Verifying the technologies are actually workable, long-term worth the investment, really good from a corporate perspective, but continue to think about the risk, because there are risks out there. The environmental cost just being one of those that I know organizations haven't been thinking as much about, but consumers are.
Thank you for that. Daniel, Christina talked about the enterprise side of things. If you're going to give those here advice on a personal side of things about how they get involved or what they begin to use, what advice might you give them as it relates to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting thing. I think someone in the chat mentioned it, right? Why haven't I seen more of DIDs and VCs versus NFTs, right? And I would say that there are interesting is a word I might use, incentive structures around NFTs. And I think a lot of that has to do with what Christina noted, which is this sort of, sell a JPEG thing going on right now. And that's going to draw a lot of money when you think you can, have your own football-sized yacht because you bought a Bored Ape on a yacht. There's going to be a lot of people trying to buy NFTs. So I think that DIDs and VCs are a little stodgier, right? They kind of just work, as it were. They like deliver value, but they don't like enrich you. They don't make any promises to enrich you in any way. What you can do is you can get involved in the standards groups. W3C and DIF primarily are the two where we do our work at Block, and I know Microsoft and others do. Those groups already have the standards in place. A lot of them already have great libraries. Sam here is like working on DIDCOM, some of the amazing libraries that use DIDs, and you can pull these things off the shelf today. They are ready. Most of the standards are very baked, so you can use them as an indie developer. You can also integrate with large corporate systems. One example is going to be Microsoft, right? And it looks like later on this year, rolling out full public GA support for DIDs and VCs in Azure Active Directory. Now, if you're a company or a government, you know what Azure Active Directory is. It pretty much is the backing identity system centralized, but backing identity service and system for 95% of the Fortune 10,000. So they will be able, every one of those companies, to issue VCs with DIDs that the companies own. And that's kind of going to be airdropped, as it were, to use a blockchain term, on essentially the entire world's business structure, which is awesome. So you're going to see DIDs and VCs come at you in a way that's sort of a very serious and there and ready to use this year, I believe, this calendar year.
Very cool. So both of these technologies place people, users of the technology, in a different role than we have elsewhere on the internet. They involve or allow you to sort of exist independent, perhaps, of sort of traditional, technical architectures online, right? They're that seems to be common with both of them. What are the implications here? What do you hope gets built on this sort of user first or user centric technology? This is an open one.
Christina, why don't I just spoke last? I'll defer.
Go ahead, Christina.
Okay. Gosh, so what can get built and what should be built? It's funny because I was just at Leap in Saudi Arabia and kind of looking at some of these really cool capabilities coming forth. My mind is sort of like all over the place. I personally am just coming back to the notion of the basics. I know that sounds really boring, but I'm a digital policy consultant, so I have to be boring by definition. I'm thinking about things, again, just like verifiable credentials, because I think that they are so important to our daily lives. Like, to me, whether I'm traveling or I'm trying to actually do something within my own universe, or if I'm trying to make sure that, in virtual reality right now, I can actually have a 3-year-old play with an actual 3-year-old and not a predator who's out there, vying on a 3-year-old. I know that sounds kind of lame, but they're the everyday use cases. And so I certainly want to see really sexy things. That's great. But I think that the sexy things, quote unquote, are only there for 20% of the time. The other 80% of the time, it really is the day-to-day stuff. So it's the AML standard that's getting adopted so that we don't have money laundering. It's the, digital identity in the EU so that, my kid can actually go to an EU school and I don't have to pay for tuition in the US. It's kind of the day-to-day really lame things, I guess. But the things that actually are the fabric of societies that I'm thinking about, that I care about, because I'm trying to understand how the use cases are going to play out based on the headlines that we're seeing already. So for example, we saw that Barbados had declared that they're going to have the first embassy in the metaverse. And my thought was like, okay, that's sort of interesting, right? What does that look like from an identity? If I'm actually in a situation where I do need to invoke on my citizenship, my identity, in a way that actually is life-saving, or it impacts my life. Like, how do I deal with that? How do you actually understand who I am? And how does that square up with how I present myself? So NFTs, presenting myself, my actual DID, my VC, which is like, my country can actually recognize me and actually save me from whatever situation I'm in. So very much kind of boring, everyday, things that kind of make the pattern of the environment is where I'm heading with this. And I'm very much stuck in a desire to see identities, because it's the fundamental of trust.
Yeah, I mean, if I have to be, maximally spicy, I would make the bold claim that DIDs plus personal data stores, with some of that data being VCs, are actually going to be the real foundation for what people aspire to with Web3. I think your personal application data store is something we're working on at Block in the TBD org. Thankfully, Jack has the foresight to be able to do this. I think that's going to be unlocked for actual decentralized apps. And when I mean decentralized apps, I don't mean strange, exotic, 150% collateralized loans on a blockchain. I don't mean things like a DAO that like dictate weird funds across the world. What I mean is real apps, like the apps on your phone, right? But decentralized. And what does that mean? I think in the future, and not too distant future, you'll be able to get a DID. You'll be able to stand up a personal data store at a host and on your devices, however you desire, however decentralized you want to be. And you will give access to apps that are literally just run on your phone to store data with you. So an app like Twitter might publish data, tweets to your personal data store. I might have Google Keep, which is the notes app I like. The only thing I don't like about it is I don't like Google in the middle of it. So maybe I have an app in the future that asks permission, and it just lives on my phone and it stores data, again, encrypted with me, right? My notes are from me. And that personal data store becomes the hub of all of your applications. No man in the middle, right? So I think that real dApps will come to be on that foundation. And I think that we'll see an acceleration of that as the implementations land this year. And what I hope to do is go capture the hope that I see in people's eyes when they look at Web3. I don't know that that's the right incarnation of it, but the aspirations are fine, right? And what I want to do is deliver something that's scalable, cheap, decentralized, and supports the wide range of use cases for those apps, and does it in a way that is, provably efficient. So we're going to try and do that this year from Block.
And if I can add, I would actually say yes, plus safe, plus I think what you implied, right, which is respectful of our privacy.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Totally. I want to add a personal note here to the unsung heroes of technical progress, right? IPv6 has never had an NFT moment, but it's like a really useful thing as it stands up and holds up the infrastructure that's underneath us, right? And so I think it might have been a surprise to lots of folks that NFTs had an NFT moment, but there's so many underlying technologies that have never really had that moment that we still all rely on every day in order to make this work. And I appreciate that. The only time people hear about DNS is when something fails, right? And then suddenly half the internet doesn't work or whatever. And so there's lots of these underlying technologies. Personally, I'm going to drop my personal opinion here a little. Getting involved, as Daniel implored, in the standards bodies that are working on this stuff is hugely beneficial to help you both understand what's coming and be able to shape how it happens so that it can better fit the needs that you've got. So whatever the organization or whatever the topic that you're particularly interested in, getting involved is hugely useful. So so excellent there. I think we have a couple we have some time for questions. And so I'll actually start paying attention to the chat a little bit and see if I can draw out questions and ask them more publicly here. While people are thinking about that, I want to ask first Christina and then Daniel, what haven't we talked about as part of this conversation that you feel like is an important thing?
Again, I'm like the non-sexy digital policy girl over here, or the digital policy Sherpa, who's going to say, you know what, we haven't talked about government regulations and where are we evolving to, and we haven't talked about human rights and identity, but that's just because, again, policy gets me really excited.
And those are long and good, important conversations. Daniel.
I think we actually did cover a ton of ground. So awesome, moderation there, Sam. I think one of the areas we could delve in a little bit more on in the future are, when we talk about privacy and verifiable credentials, how do we create verifiable credentials that maintain privacy? And a lot of that has to do with zero knowledge proofs that you bring in. So you can apply zero knowledge proof schemes to credentials and be able to minimize disclosure, be able to obfuscate the data that you give to someone. All of those things are great to really kind of drill in on. They're just a type of credential though. So I understand why we might not want to get into the weeds of some very low level schemes, but that's one thing we could explore.
Absolutely, that's a really important piece of this. This is fantastic. One more plug. I'm not associated with IIW. IIW is the Internet Identity Workshop and happens twice a year. The next one is in about a month. It's been online for the last couple, and this one is actually in person back in Mountain View where it's been held. IIW's happened like 30-ish times. I don't remember the exact count. So this is like 15 years of identity conversations. It's an unconference, and these types of conversations happen a lot there. And so if you're interested in the area, I would encourage you to look at IW and see if that's something that that you can attend. Is there any progress on authorization models in this world? How do I grant certain individual permissions to some of my data? Matthias asked that.
Yeah, so absolutely. So one thing that we're working on, we're working really hard right now. on this spec called Identity Hubs. This is, like I said, the data store piece. Now, part of being an application data store is, you obviously have to permission people to get a hold of the data that's encrypted. So one of the things that I linked to here was just a PR that we landed yesterday, which is, setting out the skeleton for a permission request and grant capability there that is grants object capabilities, which are ways that you can give someone access to your data, which they could then potentially, if you want to allow them, delegate it. So a good example of that was your primary physician might have requested a permission to some set of data. You give him a capability, or her, and then she wants to go delegate that capability when you need it, just in time, to say an ear, nose, and throat specialist who's going to only have access to maybe a portion of that data, that the doctor can decide, because you might be out on an operating table, not be able to do this. Hey, I'm going to go ahead and I'm empowered to give away access to a certain subset of what they have access to. So that's the foundation that we're landing here, and the data store is going to include that by default, and it's all based on DIDs and signatures and cryptographically verifiable authorization.
Work being done. That's excellent. Jim asks, is anyone seeing VRM or me-to-be solutions in the DID VC world? VRM is, we can blame Doc Searles for that. He coined that. This is the vendor relationship management, which is the inverse of customer relationship management. And the me-to-be is this idea that you can have a personal relationship with a business rather than just B2B, like a business to business. And so are we aware of any solutions in the DID VC world working on either VRM or me-to-be style solutions? That's Christina.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Perfila in Switzerland might be doing something in that space. Last time I checked in with them, but I don't actually understand the broader landscape and who might be working on it. So I don't know if Daniel's probably better to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, we, definitely in the lens of TBDEX, which is the first app that we want to build on the foundation of decentralized identifiers, VCs, and identity hubs. You might share certain things like, your preferences for how you want to get paid when you're doing like an economic transfer. But then there's tons of other ones, right? Like Tidal is a music business we have, and I've always pitched to them, and, they seem sort of receptive of, your music preferences or preferences you might give to a business, and then you hand them to Marriott, so that when you walk in your hotel room, they have a subset access to like maybe your favorite types of songs, and on the Sonos that they have embedded into some of these smart hotel rooms, it's already playing, right? Your favorite tracks. These are sort of the person to business exchanges that we hope are greenlit by this platform that's very soon arriving this year.
Thank you. And I know of some other projects that are very nascent and starting, but not really yet active. So I think there's going to be a lot of movement on that over the next year or so as that happens.
And Sam, we didn't touch upon this today, but the other thing I think that's out there, which I think is interesting, is sort of the extreme other aspect of, the business side and the me with business interaction, which is the World Bank is actually working on an identification for development, where by 2030, we would all have a digital ID. And I think that there's sort of an interesting concept there, not again aimed so much at the business side of things, but I think individual human rights protection, interoperability, the ability to support the human on a global scale certainly comes into mind there.
Very cool. We are getting to the end of our time here. Christina and Daniel, I'm grateful for both of you being willing to come and share your thoughts and your time with us here today. I'd like to give each of you a minute to shine a light on whatever you would like to, something that you're interested in or something that you think is worth paying attention to. Christina, why don't you give us a
I actually, my big thing is, and obviously, we're preaching to the choir if I say this here, but after this call, go tell all of your friends, relatives, coworkers, whoever will listen to you, to start understanding the implications of the various aspects of technology we talked about today. There's risks, there's opportunities, there's implications for each one of us, implications at a corporate level, as we've discussed as well. But I think what's really interesting is that there's a lot of testing and development obviously happening around blockchain, and how you want that applied to yourself and to others is really important, both from a privacy, safety, human rights perspective. And so I implore everybody to think about that, but really start talking about it, because there's really not a good way to onboard individuals into this world that's already here today and evolving. And so I would love to see more education, more conversations beyond everybody who's been on the call today, so that we can educate and onboard in a proper way.
Thank you, Christina. Daniel, what would you like to shine a light on?
Yeah, I'd say, definitely get involved with the DIDs and VC specs and the organizations DIF and W3C, help push them along. I know some of the larger internet players might need a shove or two in there. Also, understand that DIDs solved the problem, the original sin of the internet where people didn't have identity and the internet really had no answer for identity. So that's coming. VCs are the way you form trust in the web of trust. That's coming and that's here. And then this year, you're going to have application data stores that are runnable on any device. Anyone can stand them up via provider. I think we're going to kind of close the loop. And so be ready for that. When these things land, this decentralized web platform, I kind of refer to it as, be ready to use it and jump in and prove out that it works. Write your own apps on it. That's what we're going to need. If we want to really realize this, I can make as many picks, shovels, and Levi's as you want, but unless you pick them up, we're not going to get there.
Thank you, both of you. I'm grateful for your time here, and I hope this was an informative and a useful meeting to all who attended. It was recorded and will be posted online in DCO Tech on Twitter. You'll be able to find that when we do post it. We'll tweet the link to the video. And thank you for everyone. Maya, back to you.
Thank you, Daniel and Christina and Sam. It was an amazing discussion. I personally really enjoyed it. And as Sam said, it's going to be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So you are welcome to join and subscribe. And our next month, April, Earth Day is coming up. So our topic is about something related to eco-friendly, and we will announce shortly. But our date is set April 19th, and you're welcome to register now. And thank you again, everyone, for coming, and see you next month.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.